That a tractor or museum piece? Kevin Hartle didn't say it quietly. He said it at Hagen's feed store on a Tuesday morning in February 1983, loud enough for the 6 men standing in the cold with their coffees to hear it, loud enough for the man it was aimed at to hear it from where he stood 15 feet away by his truck, and loud enough that a couple of those men shifted on their boots the way people shift when someone says something out loud in the room, or in this case, the gravel lot, suddenly gets quieter than it was a second before. The tractor in question was parked at the edge of the lot, next to a Ford F-150 that looked about as old. It was red, or it had been red, once, when it came off the assembly line. 13 years of Nebraska sun and Dawson County dust had faded it to something between brick and rust. 105 horsepower, a 414 cubic inch 6-cylinder engine, no computer, no GPS, no cab. It was a 1971 International Farmall 1066, and it was the most talked about piece of farm equipment in Gothenburg, Nebraska, for reasons that had nothing to do with what it could do on a field and everything to do with what it represented. The man who owned it was Don Magnuson, 69 years old, 6'2", built like a man who had spent 50 years doing work that doesn't let you go soft. He was standing by his truck with a thermos of coffee, watching the morning the way old farmers watch mornings, taking inventory of the sky, the wind, the way the light hit the ground. He heard Kevin's joke. He turned his head. He looked at the younger man, the seed seller, the new one, the one who'd rolled into town 4 months earlier with a leased storefront and a smile that assumed the center of every room. And he looked at him the way you look at weather, acknowledging it, not moved by it. Then Don Magnuson turned and walked inside Hagen's to buy his seed corn, and he didn't say a word, and that was that. Or so Kevin Hartle thought. That laugh, that small, easy laugh on a cold Tuesday in February, was going to cost Kevin Hartle more than he could have imagined. Not because Don Magnuson was the kind of man who held grudges. He wasn't. It was going to cost him because the laugh revealed something about Kevin Hartle, about what he understood and what he didn't. And in the months and years that followed, as the ground shifted under every farm in Dawson County, what you understood and what you didn't was the difference between survival and ruin. Now, before I take you deeper into what happened in Gothenburg between 1983 and 1986, I want to be straightforward about what this story is and where it comes from. Everything you're about to hear, the economics, the equipment, the financial pressures, the way communities came apart during this period, is drawn from documented history, USDA agricultural census data, farm credit system records, congressional testimony from the 1985 Farm Bill hearings, interviews with farmers and farm families who lived through exactly this kind of crisis across the Midwest. The names, the specific conversations, certain details have been shaped from multiple real accounts into a single narrative. But the bones of the story, the debt structures, the land price collapse, the equipment values, the way institutions failed the people they were supposed to serve, that is real. That happened. It happened in 100 towns that look like Gothenburg. And for some of you watching this, it didn't happen to strangers. So I'm going to tell it the way it deserves to be told. With care. If your family went through something like this, if you watched a farm disappear, if you were one of the kids standing in the yard when the auctioneer came, I want you to know this channel exists partly for you, to tell these stories with the seriousness they deserve. If you have a story of your own, leave it in the comments. I read every one of them. To understand why Kevin Hartle could walk into Gothenburg in the fall of 1982 and think he had the right to laugh at an old man's tractor, to understand why that laugh seemed, at the time, like it might even be funny, you need to understand what happened to American agriculture in the 5 years before that. Because the late 1970s were, for a brief and genuinely dangerous time, the best years farming had seen in a generation. And they made a lot of people very confident about things that turned out to be wrong. In 1977, corn was bringing in over $2 a bushel at the elevator. Soybeans were hitting $3.50. Land in the Platte Valley in Nebraska, the kind of flat, dark, fertile ground that Don Magnuson had been farming since the 1950s, was selling for $1,200 an acre, and it kept climbing. By 1979, some parcels were going for $1,800. By 1980, you could find ground in Dawson County trading at $2,000 an acre or more. Farmers who paid $50 an acre in the 60s were sitting on paper fortunes. And the banks knew it. Lord, did the banks know it. The production credit associations and the farm credit banks were lending money to farmers like it was going out of style. If you had land as collateral, and if your land was worth what the market said it was worth, you could borrow against it. And everyone told you to do exactly that. The extension agents, the bankers, the equipment dealers, the men at the feed store, the men at the elevator, the men at every gathering place where farmers talked about what was happening. Expand. Buy more ground. Buy new equipment. Put everything you can into the ground. Because the prices are there and the money is there, and anyone who doesn't take it is leaving money on the table. Prime rate hit 21.5% in 1980, the highest it had been in American history. But even at those rates, the bankers were approving loans because the land values kept going up, and when land values go up, the math on paper looks safe. It almost never is when the math depends on prices going up forever. But nobody was saying that out loud. Not yet. Don Magnuson didn't borrow. Not like that. Not during the boom. And that fact, that single, quiet fact about a 69-year-old man in a faded red Farmall, is the center of everything that follows. Don had started farming in 1955. At 22 years old, on 320 acres, his father left him when the old man died of pneumonia that winter. 320 acres of Dawson County bottomland. A Farmall H that was already 15 years old when Don inherited it, and $40 in his pocket. That was the entire inheritance. He worked it for 3 seasons before he could scrape together enough to buy another parcel, 160 acres from a neighbor who was getting too old to work it. Then another parcel, a few years later. Slow, steady, the way you build something that's meant to last. By 1965, Don had 1,100 acres. By 1975, he was at 2,200. He bought the last parcel, 640 acres on the east side of town, in 1976, when the land rush was just beginning, at $180 an acre. He paid for it mostly in cash, with a short-term note from the local bank that was retired by the end of 1979. 3,200 acres. The largest single farming operation in Dawson County. Nobody talked about it much. Don didn't talk about it. He drove a beat-up Ford pickup and wore the same coveralls he'd worn for a decade and ate at the diner in town the same as everyone else, and never once, in 30 years of farming, made a public statement about his financial position. The land records were public, of course. Anyone could have gone to the Dawson County Courthouse and looked at what Don Magnuson owned. But in a town like Gothenburg, population a little over 3,000, the kind of place where people knew each other's business without having to look it up, you didn't need to check. The older folks knew. The bankers knew. The men who had watched Don buy that land acre by acre, parcel by parcel, over the course of 3 decades, they knew. Kevin Hartle didn't know. Kevin Hartle had been in town 4 months. Agnes Magnuson, née Holbrook, from Columbus, Nebraska, had died in the spring of 1979. Heart attack. She was 64. Don had found her that morning in the kitchen, seated at the table with her coffee, as if she had simply decided to stop. The doctor said it was quick. Don didn't talk about it. Not then. Not to anyone except perhaps the Lord on Sunday mornings at the Lutheran church on the corner of Main and 3rd. His son Thomas had come back from Denver for the funeral, stayed 4 days, and gone again. Thomas had left Gothenburg in 1973, when it became clear there was enough land left for a second son to farm, and Don had never asked him to stay. He understood that. He understood a lot of things that other men his age didn't, about how the world worked and what you could ask of people and what you couldn't. So by February of 1983, Don Magnuson was a 69-year-old widower farming 3,200 acres alone, with equipment he'd owned for years and land he'd paid for with his own hands, and he had a Farmall 1066 that a man named Kevin Hartle thought was funny. The contrast between Don and his neighbors was not just about how much land each man owned. It was about a philosophy, a way of thinking about debt and risk and the future. And in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, Don's philosophy was a minority position. It was, in fact, the position that made you look like you weren't paying attention. Take a man named Ray Callahan, 46 years old, in 1983. Ray farmed 1,200 acres east of town. Good ground, productive, well-drained. Ray was a good farmer, hard-working, respected in the community. But Ray wanted more, the way a lot of men wanted more in those years. And in 1980, he went to Production Credit Association in North Platte and borrowed $180,000 to buy another 400 acres. The ground was priced at $1,800 an acre. The PCA said yes. Then Ray went to the John Deere dealer over in Kearney and bought a brand new 4450. That tractor had just come out, part of the new 50 series that John Deere introduced in 1983 to replace the older 40 series machines. 140 horsepower, turbocharged, computerized fuel injection, a cab with air conditioning and a stereo. It cost $52,000, another loan, and a new planter and an upgrade on his combine. You see where this is going. Ray Callahan, by the end of 1981, had somewhere around $340,000 in outstanding debt. His land, at the peak prices, was assessed at roughly $2.8 million. On paper, the ratio looked fine. The bank was happy. The PCA was happy. Ray was happy. Or at least he looked happy. The way men look happy when the numbers are working and the future seems to be on their side. Don Magnuson, at the exact same time, had maybe $12,000 left on the final note from his last land purchase and 3,200 acres that he had essentially paid for himself over the course of 30 years. His equipment was old. His truck was old. His tractor was old. But here's the thing about Don's position that the boom years made almost invisible. He owed almost nothing. In a world where land values were climbing every month, that fact didn't seem to matter. Everyone was making money, or seemed to be, or at least everyone was getting richer on paper. And Don's conservatism, his refusal to leverage up, his quiet insistence on paying things off before he moved on to the next thing, looked, to younger men like Ray Callahan, like timidity, like not understanding how the game was played. Kevin Hartle would have agreed. Kevin understood the game, or thought he did. He had come to Gothenburg from Omaha in the fall of 1982 and leased a storefront on Main Street and set up shop selling seed corn and soybeans. Pioneer hybrid varieties, mostly good seed. He knew his product. He'd worked in agricultural sales in eastern Nebraska for 5 years before striking out on his own. What Kevin also had was a personality, the kind of personality that fills a room, that tells jokes, that assumes the center of every conversation without anyone quite noticing how it happened. He was 33 years old, reasonably handsome in an unremarkable way, dressed more like a businessman than a farmer, and drove a 1982 Ford Ranger that was clean enough to suggest he had never spent a serious day on a dirt road. He was, in short, everything Don Magnuson was not. And in Gothenburg in the early 1980s, Kevin's version of farming, loud, confident, forward-looking, seemed like it might be the right version. The seed business, in those first months, was good. Farmers were planting maximum acreage because the economics still justified it. Prices were decent, credit was available, and the instinct to put as much in the ground as possible was deeply rooted. Kevin moved product. He made friends. He became, in the way that new arrivals sometimes do in small towns, a minor fixture. And the joke about Don's farm became something he came back to regularly because it got a laugh, and because Kevin was the kind of man who liked getting laughs. The joke was not, to be fair, entirely without basis. The Farmall 1066, for all that it was a well-maintained and mechanically sound piece of equipment, was genuinely outdated by the standards of 1983. No turbocharger, no power shift transmission. The hydraulic system, while functional, couldn't match what a modern John Deere or Case machine could do. If you were farming competitively, if you care about speed, about efficiency per acre, about keeping up with the pace the industry was setting, you were not doing it with a 13-year-old tractor. Most of Don's neighbors had upgraded at least once during the boom years. New John Deeres, new Case machines, the whole catalog of what American agriculture looked like when money was flowing and the future seemed bright. But here is what Kevin Hartle, in his 4 months in Gothenburg, had not learned, and what the joke missed entirely. Don Magnuson had replaced that Farmall exactly 0 times in 13 years because he did not need to replace it. The 1066 ran. It ran because Don maintained it. He had rebuilt the engine himself in 1978, new piston rings, new bearings, reground the valves, all of it done in his own machine shed with tools that had belonged to his father before him. The tractor was mechanically as good as the day it left the factory, and it cost Don Magnuson nothing to keep it running. No loan payments, no dealer service calls at $150 an hour, no parts that had to be special order from a dealership 2 counties over. Don could fix anything on that 1066 with a socket set, a torque wrench, and a parts catalog he kept on a shelf in the machine shed. The machine was simple. He understood it completely. And that simplicity, that total mastery of a piece of equipment, was worth more than all the horsepower in the world if what you needed was reliability and 0 overhead. Compare that to Ray Callahan's brand new John Deere 4450. Beautiful machine, 140 horsepower, computerized. But when something went wrong on that tractor, and something always went wrong, especially during planting season, when a single day of downtime could cost a farmer thousands of dollars, Ray had to call the dealer, and the dealer charged accordingly. And the parts were expensive, and the service was expensive, and sometimes Ray had to borrow to cover repair bills because the cash flow wasn't there. The payments on the 4450 alone were eating $600 a month. The land payments were eating $1,200 a month. And the commodity prices, which had been holding up the whole structure, were about to stop cooperating. There's another layer to the Farmall story that adds a strange and uncomfortable irony to everything Kevin Hartle said about Don's tractor, and it has to do with the brand itself. International Harvester, the company that built the Farmall 1066, the company whose red paint was fading on Don's machine, was, by the early 1980s, in serious financial trouble of its own. IH had been one of the great names in American manufacturing. For a century, their tractors had plowed the plains, broken sod, fed the country. But by 1981 and 1982, the company was hemorrhaging money, bad management decisions, labor disputes, a shrinking market share as John Deere and Case ate into their territory. In 1982, International Harvester came within weeks of filing for bankruptcy. They restructured. They slashed their workforce. They sold off divisions. And in 1985, they would sell their entire tractor and agricultural equipment business to Tenneco, which also owned Case, and the merged company would become Case IH. International Harvester itself would become Navistar International, a truck manufacturer with no connection to land, to farming, to the identity that had defined the company for generations. So the brand on Don's Farmall was dying. The company that had made it was falling apart. And Don Magnuson was still driving it, still trusting it, still getting more honest work out of it per acre than most men in the county were getting out of machines that cost 5 times as much. Because Don understood something about machines and about farming and about life in general that no amount of horsepower or computerization could teach you. A tool is not good because it is new. A tool is good because you know it, because you have maintained it, because you understand what it can do and what it cannot, and you work with it instead of against it. And you never, ever let ego drive the decision about what equipment you run. I want to pause here for a moment, because this is where the story turns. And I want to hear from people who were there. If you lived through the farm crisis, if you watched the boom turn into the bust, if you made decisions in the late 70s that looked smart at the time and looked catastrophic by 1985, I want to know, what were the choices really like? What was it like to be told by every institution and every voice around you to borrow and expand, and then watch all of it disappear? Leave your thoughts in the comments. This is your history too. The thing about a crash is that it does not announce itself. It does not come with a warning shot or a siren or a letter from Washington saying the boom is over. It comes the way winter comes to the Nebraska plains, gradually, quietly, and then all at once. And by the time you look up and realize the ground is frozen, it has been frozen for a while, and you just didn't notice. In 1983, the federal government implemented the PIK program, payment in kind. The idea was simple on its surface. The government would pay farmers, in surplus grain, to leave fields fallow, reduce the supply, shore up prices, stabilize the market, It was an admission, though nobody in Washington said it that way, that there was too much grain in the world, that prices were going down, that the boom, the beautiful confident boom that had driven land prices to the sky and filled the bank's loan portfolios, was ending. Corn prices, which had been holding above $2 a bushel through most of 1982, started sliding. By early 1984, they were at $1.80. By midsummer, $1.60. Soybeans dropped from $3.50 to under $2.80. And the thing that mattered most, the thing that held up every loan, every mortgage, every financial calculation that had been made in the late 1970s, was land prices. And land prices started falling too. Not fast, at first. The way these things go, the decline was gradual enough that people kept telling themselves it was temporary. A correction. A dip. Something that would bounce back. Bankers said it. Extension agents said it. Men at the feed store said it. But it did not bounce back. Not in 1984. Not in 1985. Land in the Platte Valley, which had peaked at $2,000 an acre or more, started dropping to $1,500, then $1,200. Then, by 1986, some parcels were going for $600 or $700 an acre. The paper fortunes that farmers had been sitting on evaporated, and the debt that had been borrowed against those paper fortunes, did not evaporate with them. The debt stayed exactly where it was. The first foreclosure notice went up at the Dawson County Courthouse in the fall of 1984, a farm on the west side of town. The name was not one that anyone would have predicted, a family that had been farming the area for 2 generations. Then another notice, then 3 more in the same month. By the spring of 1985, the Production Credit Association in North Platte had called in loans on 14 farms in Dawson County. 14. In a county where there were maybe 60 serious farming operations, that was nearly 1 in 4. And the numbers were only getting worse. There is a detail about those foreclosures that did not come out until years later, when the Farm Credit Administration released internal audit documents that they had kept quiet during the crisis itself. Those documents showed that loan officers within the farm credit system were being pressured by their own management, by the institutional imperative to clean up bad loans before quarterly financial reports, to accelerate foreclosure proceedings, to move faster than the law technically required, to get the paperwork filed and the properties liquidated before anyone higher up had to explain the losses on a balance sheet. The farmers who received those notices did not know that. They didn't know that the timeline they were being given, 90 days, sometimes less, was being compressed for reasons that had nothing to do with their individual situations and everything to do with institutional self-preservation. They just knew the number on the notice. They just knew they owed more than the land was worth. And they knew they were running out of time. Ray Callahan got his notice in January of 1985. He had missed 2 payments on his land note and 3 on his equipment loan. The math was brutal and simple. He owed $340,000. His land at the current market was worth maybe $900 an acre. His 1,600 acres, the original 1,200 plus the 400 he bought in 1980, were worth roughly $1.44 million on paper, which sounded like a lot until you realized the equity was gone, eaten by the debt and the collapse in value. He was underwater by more than $100,000, and there was no way to dig out, not at corn prices of $1.60 a bushel, not at the interest rates he was paying, not with any realistic projection of what the next year or 2 looked like. Ray's wife Linda found out about the notice on a Thursday afternoon when she came into the kitchen and saw him sitting at the table with the envelope open in front of him and his hands flat on the wood like he was trying to hold the table down. She didn't ask what it was. She could see what it was. She sat down across from him, and they looked at each other for a long time without saying anything. And then Linda said, "What do we do?" And Ray said, "I don't know." And that was the conversation. That was the whole conversation, because there was nothing else to say. Kevin Hartle's seed business started feeling the pressure in the fall of 1984. Farmers who had bought seed on credit, which was common, especially in the spring, when operating cash was tight, were not paying their accounts. Not because they were dishonest, because they didn't have the money. The crop hadn't covered the input costs. The margins were gone. Kevin was carrying $40,000 in receivables by January of 1985, and he was starting to think seriously about how much of that money he was ever going to see. The man who had laughed at Don Magnussen's tractor was now sitting at his own desk in his own storefront on Main Street, looking at his own numbers, and for the first time in his life, the numbers were looking at him back with something close to contempt. Kevin's situation was not as dire as Ray Callahan's. Kevin had never put his own land on the line, because Kevin didn't own land. He was a businessman, not a farmer. But his business depended on farmers being able to pay him, and the farmers were not paying, and the town was getting quieter every month, and the storefronts on Main Street were starting to go dark one by one. Kevin had started to notice something about Don Magnussen. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you don't pay attention to until the world shifts underneath you, and suddenly the things you overlook become the only things that make sense. Don came into the seed shop on the same schedule he always had, March, for planting season, and he bought exactly what he needed, no more, no less, and he paid cash. Same as always. He didn't complain about prices. He didn't talk about his operating loan, because he didn't have one. He didn't look worried, the way the other men looked worried, the way Ray Callahan looked worried, the way half the men in Dawson County looked worried when they came into town and stood at the counter and couldn't quite meet anyone's eyes. Don just bought his seed and thanked Kevin, a quiet nod, nothing more, and walked out into the February cold and drove away in his beat-up Ford. Kevin asked around, carefully, the way you ask when you're trying to learn something without letting on that you didn't already know it. He asked at the diner. He asked at the grain elevator. He asked a man named Harold Briggs, who was 72 years old and had been in Gothenburg his entire life and knew everything about everyone, the way certain old men in small towns do, as if they've been keeping a ledger in their heads for decades and could pull up any name at any time. Harold looked at Kevin for a long moment, one of those looks that seemed to take the measure of you, the full measure, all at once. And then Harold said, simply, "You know how big Don Magnussen's farm is?" Kevin shrugged. He had assumed it was small, a few hundred acres, maybe. An old man alone with an old tractor. That was what it looked like. That was the picture Kevin had painted in his own head from months ago when he had first seen the Farmall in the gravel lot and decided it was funny. Harold told him the number, 3,200 acres. Kevin blinked. He owns it. Kevin asked, free and clear? Harold nodded. Bought the last piece in 76. Paid it off by 79. Agnes is gone, but the land is his. Has been for years. Kevin stood there for a minute, processing that. 3,200 acres. The biggest farm in Dawson County. Owned outright by a man driving a 13-year-old tractor and a truck that had seen better decades. Kevin had laughed at that tractor. He had laughed at it in front of other men. And the man who owned it owned more ground than any other single farmer in the county, and owed less on it than Kevin owed on his lease for the storefront on Main Street. The thing about a small town is that information travels like water through sand. Slowly, but it gets everywhere eventually. Kevin's discovery about Don Magnussen was not a secret. It had never been a secret, but it became a conversation, and then it became a conversation, especially as the foreclosures mounted and the diner got quieter, and men started running the numbers in their own heads. Compare what they had to what Don had, comparing the debt on their books to zero on Don's. 3,200 acres, paid for, in a county where land was still worth, even at the crash prices, even at the bottom, $600 to $800 an acre. Don Magnussen's farm was worth somewhere between $1.9 million and $2.5 million, and he had essentially no mortgage on it. Meanwhile, the county was hemorrhaging farms. The PCA was filing foreclosure paperwork on a near-weekly basis. Men who'd been farming for 20 years, men whose fathers had farmed the same ground before them, were losing everything they had built. Auctions were being scheduled. Equipment was being sold for a fraction of what it had cost. At a machinery auction in Dawson County in the spring of 1985, a case 2394, a solid 140-horsepower tractor that had cost close to $48,000 new when it rolled off a line in 1981, sold for $14,000. $14,000. The man who had bought it was not there to bid. He couldn't be. The bank owned it now. The PCA had taken it as part of the foreclosure settlement. He stood at the back of the crowd with his arms crossed and watched strangers raise their hands and bid on his life's work, piece by piece, lot by lot, and he didn't say a word, because there was nothing left to say. The numbers had said everything. Don Magnuson was at that auction, too. He stood near the back, same as the other man, arms crossed. He didn't buy anything. He didn't need to. His equipment was old, but it worked. But he watched. He watched the whole thing, from the first lot to the last. And some of the men there, seeing Don standing quietly at the back of the crowd while their own equipment was being sold off in front of them, felt something complicated. Something that wasn't quite resentment and wasn't quite admiration, but lived somewhere in between, in the uncomfortable territory where envy and respect overlap. Don Magnuson was not a man who made speeches. He didn't organize rallies or show up at the State House or get on television. He was not that kind of man. Agnes might have been. Agnes had a way of making things happen, a quiet authority that could move people without raising her voice. But Agnes was gone, and Don was Don, and the way he moved through the world was quietly, and the things he did without announcement. But there were things people remembered. In the summer of 1985, when Ray Callahan's foreclosure was proceeding and Ray was trying to figure out where his family was going to live, because the house was on the same parcel as the farm, and the parcel was being taken by the PCA, and there was nowhere to go, Don Magnuson showed up at Ray's door one evening after supper. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets, and he said, in that quiet way of his, that there was a hired man's cottage on his property, a small place, nothing fancy, but it was empty, and had been empty for years, and Ray and Linda, and the kids could move in if they needed to. No rent, no conditions, no timeline. Just come live there for as long as you need. Linda Callahan cried when she heard it. Not in front of Don, not in front of anyone at first, but later, alone in the kitchen of the house they were about to lose. She sat down and put her face in her hands and cried the way women cry when someone has just offered them something they didn't think anyone was going to offer. Ray didn't cry, not in front of anyone, but his hands were shaking when he shook Don's hand on the porch that evening, and Don saw it, and Don didn't say anything about it, because he knew what it was like to be a man who couldn't cry in public, and he knew that sometimes the kindest thing another man can do is pretend not to notice. There were other things. A quiet word to a banker. Not asking for special treatment, just making sure someone with authority was paying attention to a family that was about to fall through the cracks. $100 put into the collection plate at the Lutheran church on a Sunday when the congregation was trying to raise money for a family in the community that had lost everything. Small things. The kind of things that don't make the history books. The kind of things that hold a town together when everything else is coming apart. In September of 1985, Farm Aid happened. Willie Nelson organized it, with Neil Young and John Mellencamp driving the effort, and they raised $12.4 million in a single concert in Indianapolis. The whole country watched, or most of it did. In Gothenburg, people crowded into the diner and watched it on the television in the corner, and some of them cried and some of them didn't, and all of them understood, in a way that no one in the stadium in Indianapolis could have understood what the music was about. Not entertainment. Witness. A declaration that someone outside of Dawson County, someone outside of Nebraska, someone in the wider world had finally noticed what was happening to the people who grew the food, that the crisis was real, that it was not the farmers' fault, that the system, the banks, the policies, the structures that were supposed to support family farming in America had failed them. The money from Farm Aid went to a trust. Grants were made to farm families in crisis. It helped some people. Not nearly enough people, not even close, but it meant something. It meant that the story had broken through, that the silence that had surrounded the farm crisis for years, the silence that let it happen in the dark in small towns, in kitchens, without anyone in Washington or New York paying attention, was finally being broken. Don watched the concert at home, alone, in the farmhouse where Agnes used to sit across from him at dinner. He didn't say much about it afterward, but the next Sunday at church, during the collection, Harold Briggs, who was sitting in the pew next to Don, saw him put $50 in the plate, and Harold remembered that for years afterward, the way you remember small things that tell you something true about a person. Here is a part of Don Magnussen's story that does not fit neatly into the narrative. The part that complicates the picture. Because the title of this video promises a certain kind of story. The wise old man, the humble tractor, the punchline that the biggest farm belonged to the man everyone laughed at. And that story is true, as far as it goes. Don survived. He kept his land. He kept his Farmall. He kept farming. In that sense, he won the game that the 1980s played against American farmers. He won the way the tortoise wins. Quietly, without drama, by simply still being there when everyone else had been swept away. But winning isn't always what it looks like from the outside. Don was 70 years old in 1986. He was farming 3,200 acres alone. No hired man. Not at the margins farming was offering in those years. With commodity prices where they were and operating costs where they were, there was no money for hired labor, no son to help with the work. Thomas was in Denver, working in construction, raising his own family, building a life that had nothing to do with Nebraska soil or Dawson County weather. The invitation to come home had never been issued because Don had never learned how to ask for the things he needed. Agnes would have made that call. Agnes would have picked up the phone and said to Thomas, simply, "Your father needs help. Come home." She had that way. She could say things that needed to be said without anyone feeling diminished by the saying of them. But Agnes was gone, and Don was alone with that land. And the land was the biggest farm in the county. And it was also, by 1986, one of the loneliest places in Nebraska. His body was starting to tell him things he didn't want to hear. His back ached every morning. The kind of deep, structural ache that comes from decades of physical labor and doesn't respond to aspirin or rest. His hands, big hands, hands that had pulled fence wire and started engines and turned wrenches for 50 years, were developing arthritis. The cold made it worse. He could still work. He could still do what the farm required, day by day, season by season. But the margin between what his body could do and what 3,200 acres demanded was getting thinner every year. And he knew it, and he didn't talk about it to anyone because that was who he was. The biggest farm in town. The biggest farm in Dawson County. And no one to farm it after him. That's the cost. That's what survival looked like for Don Magnussen in the middle of the 1980s. He had the land. He had the equity. He had survived the worst agricultural disaster since the Great Depression, while farms collapsed around him, while men he had known for decades lost everything, while the county lost a fifth of its farming operations in 3 years. He had done it by being careful, by being slow, by being exactly the kind of farmer that the boom years had made look foolish. And he had no one to tell about it, no one to sit across the table from and say, quietly, "We made it." No one to leave it to. Kevin Hartle closed a seed shop in the spring of 1986. He had lasted 3.5 years in Gothenburg. Not bad for a man from Omaha who had never farmed a single acre himself. But not good enough. Either not when half his customers couldn't pay him, and the other half had cut back their planting acreage because the economics had changed overnight, and there was no reason to put maximum ground into the dirt when the prices wouldn't cover the cost of doing it. Kevin didn't leave with ceremony. He packed up his inventory over a weekend, settled what he could with his suppliers, and drove back to Omaha in his Ford Ranger. The truck was not as clean as it had been when he arrived. Gothenburg had left some dust on it, and some of the confidence it had carried when it first rolled into town. Kevin was 36 years old when he left. He had not lost everything. He had never had enough invested to lose everything. He had just lost a business, and 3 years and whatever certainty he had carried into the county about what success looked like, and who had it and who didn't. Don Magnussen, for his part, never mentioned Kevin Hartle. Not once. In any conversation that anyone recorded or remembered. When someone asked him about the seed seller, about the joke, about the Farmall, Don would shrug in his way, a slight movement of the shoulders, nothing dramatic, and say something like, "He sold good seed." And that was the end of it, because Don was not a man who needed the last word. He was a man who had the last farm. What Don Magnussen understood, what the farm crisis of the 1980s taught, in foreclosure notices and empty storefronts and auctions where men sold their lives for pennies, was a principle that sounds simple when you say it out loud, but is almost impossible to follow when everyone around you is doing the opposite. The principle was this: The value of land is not the same as the price of land. And the price of land is not the same as the money you can borrow against it. In the late 1970s, when ground was selling for $2,000 an acre and banks were lending at 80% of appraised value, a farmer could borrow $1,600 an acre against his land. That felt like security. It felt like wealth. It felt, for a brief and genuinely intoxicating period, like the way farming was supposed to work, like the reward were finally arriving after generations of hard work and thin margins and watching other industries get rich while the people who grew the food scraped by. But the moment the price dropped, the moment land went from $2,000 to $800 an acre, all that borrowed wealth disappeared. The debt did not disappear with it. Only the collateral did. Don had never borrowed against his land that way. He bought what he could pay for. He maintained his equipment instead of replacing it. He didn't expand during the boom because he couldn't have farmed any more acres than he already had, alone at his age with the equipment he had. And that constraint, that limitation, turned out, when the crash came, to be his greatest asset. The thing that looked like weakness, the old tractor, the paid-off land, the refusal to play the game everyone else was playing, turned out to be the thing that saved him. These same financial principles apply today. Modern farmers are making decisions about $500,000 combines and million-dollar land purchases, and the debt-to-equity calculations they run are not so different from the ones Ray Callahan ran in 1980. The numbers are bigger. The equipment is smarter. The GPS systems and the precision agriculture technology would have seemed like science fiction to Don Magnuson. But the fundamental risk is identical. If you borrow against rising land prices and the prices fall, the debt remains. Agricultural economics programs teach the 1980s farm crisis as a case study precisely because the lessons never go away. They are structural. They are built into the way farming and banking and land ownership work. And they will be relevant as long as there are farmers and lenders and the eternal, dangerous distance between what the land is worth and what someone will pay for it. Don Magnuson farmed that ground for another 6 years after crisis bottomed out. Into the early 1990s. Slowly, methodically, the way he had always farmed, one season at a time, one field at a time, with the Farmall 1066 and the older combine and the tools his father had left him. His son Thomas came back to visit in 1989, and they walked the fields together. The first time they had done that in 15 years, and Thomas looked at the land and looked at his father and saw something he had not fully understood when he left in 1973. He saw what it meant to have built something that lasted, not something flashy or impressive or loud, something that simply endured through the boom and the bust and the years in between, because it had been built with care and patience and a clear-eyed understanding of what the ground could give and what it couldn't. Don sold the farm in 1993, at 79 years old, when his body finally told him what he had known for a while, that he could not do it alone anymore, and that asking for help was not something he was to learn how to do at that age. He sold it to a family from Sydney, Nebraska, who paid fair market value, and planned to farm it the way Don had farmed it, carefully, with respect for ground, without betting more than they could afford to lose. Don kept the Farmall 1066. He kept it in the machine shed for 2 more years, the way a man keeps something that's been with him for decades, something that has outlasted marriages and recessions and the slow erosion of everything else. And then he let it go too, because a man can only hold on to so much of the past before the past becomes a weight instead of a comfort, and Don Magnuson had spent his whole life understanding the difference. He died in 1997 at 83, in a small house in North Platte where Thomas had set him up, quietly, the way he had lived. The obituary in the local paper mentioned the farm, the size of it, the years he had worked it. It did not mention the Farmall. It did not mention Kevin Hartle or the joke or any of the small, complicated drama that had played out in Gothenburg in the middle of the decade that nearly destroyed American farming. Those details lived where small-town stories live, in memory, in conversation, in the things people told each other at the diner or the feed store or the Lutheran church, long after the events themselves were over. The farm is still there. Someone else's name on the deed now, but the ground is the same ground. The same black Nebraska soil that Don Magnuson bought for $50 an acre 60 years ago. The same soil that his father farmed before him. Still producing. Still worth something. Still, By most accounts, one of the better parcels in Dawson County. The land doesn't remember who owned it. It doesn't care about debt-to-equity ratios or prime rates or the confidence of seed sellers. It just produces year after year, the way it has for 10,000 years, and will keep producing long after every name associated with it has been forgotten. But somewhere in a record, in the county courthouse, in the land abstracts, in the quiet history of a small town in western Nebraska, the name Don Magnuson is written. And next to it, in a way that records sometimes capture more than they mean to, is the size of what he built. 3,200 acres, the biggest farm in town. These stories matter because they are not finished. The forces that crushed family farms in the 1980s, the leverage, the speculation, the institutional pressures that turned productive land into a financial instrument, the way banks and government agencies and the structure of agricultural lending itself conspired to reward risk-taking and punish caution. Those forces did not disappear when the crisis ended. They adapted. They got bigger. They learned how to hide better. And the families who remember what happened in the 1980s, the ones who lived it, the ones who watched it, the ones who are still, decades later, living with the consequences, are the ones best equipped to recognize the shape of it when it comes around again. If you have been watching this channel, you already know what I am about to say. And if this is the first video you have seen here, if someone sent it to you or you found it because some part of the story is your family story, the story of the town you grew up in, then here it is. These videos exist because this history deserves to be told with care, not as entertainment, not as background noise while you do something else, as preservation, as testimony, as a record of what happened to people who fed this country and were told by the institutions that were supposed to serve them that they were doing it wrong and lost everything and kept going anyway. Because that is what farmers do. If that matters to you, if the truth of what happened in rural America in the 1980s matters to you, you know what to do. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you were there, if you watched it happen, if you lived it, if you're still carrying it, leave your story in the comments. Every single one of those stories is worth telling. Every one of them deserves to be heard. Thank you for staying. And Don, wherever you are, the record shows what it shows. You had the biggest farm in town, and you earned every acre of it.